Welcome to the Business Model Sandbox, where leaders come to not just tweak the way the world works today, but to imagine complete transformation, entire new ways to create, deliver, and capture value. I'm Saul Kaplan. I'm your host. I'm the founder and chief catalyst here at BIF, and each month I get the honor and privilege of bringing someone from our community who doesn't just think about, but is in the process of transforming the world around them, and we can just learn so much from each of our guests, and today's is no different. Today, I welcome, or I should say, I re-welcome Andrew Hessel, my friend. He's my go-to guy in the genomics space. He calls himself a genomic futurist and catalyst. I think every time I've introduced him, he's no stranger to the Business Model Sandbox or to the BIF Summit stage. Every time I introduce him, I tried some different ways, and as he does. But he's the CEO of Humane Genomics, Inc., so we want to hear about his entrepreneurial piece. He's the co-founder of an incredibly cool project called Genome Project Write. We're actually writing DNA, and we want to dive into that. And I welcome him back for a couple of reasons. One, he's just so much fun to talk with. Two, genomics is changing so quickly. We have to touch base with Andrew, just to get a current sense of what's going on. And three, the latest bucket list project that I'm focused on, called Personalized Medicine by Design here at BIF, is going all in on this vision of how do we enable new models with individuals and family at its core. And I want to understand how emerging technology can help us bring that vision to life. So this is now the second in our emerging tech series for Personalized Medicine by Design, but it will also go out as a Business Model Sandbox podcast. Welcome back to the Business Model Sandbox, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing really well, Saul. Thanks for having me.
What did I get wrong in your title this time? Do you still call yourself a genomic futurist and catalyst?
Absolutely. I like to say I live in the future, and I try and translate it and bring it down to earth for people, as well as go and work on the forefront and push the boundaries myself.
Yeah, no, and we're going to, let's touch on both of those. Let's start with just, bring us current and give us a little bit of the historical perspective on genomics and where it's come. It's head-exploding stuff with so many implications, and you describe it better than anybody that I know. Where are we?
Well, let's just say the trend is continuing. Genomics is a relatively new field. We really just started deciphering the genetic code really in the last 50 years. I think this is the most significant, one of the most significant fields in the world today, because this is a living world. We know that we are living creatures, but we're surrounded by living creatures, both macroscopic plants and animals, but also microscopic, bacteria and viruses, etc. And the important thing to understand is that it's all of life is based on a universal foundational architecture of the cell and the subcellular systems that make cells. And importantly, the cellular systems are conserved between bacteria, plants, and animals, and the programming language of DNA is also very conserved. So once it starts picking up a head of steam, the more you learn and understand about genomics, the more broadly it can be applied. So we've been reading genomes now for upwards of 50 years. We are learning as a community to understand the code of life, and more recently, with the emergence of the biotech industry, we've learned how to start writing code. First, doing very simple proteins. Now, metabolism. We're starting to build biological circuits that can sense what's happening in a cell and direct cellular activity. And more importantly, we're moving to the point where we're going to start being able to design and build living organisms from scratch. The first example being synthetic bacterial cells that were made almost a decade ago now. So these combined, this opens up a really powerful new lens into the world around us and can potentially change manufacturing of just about any what we so-called natural compounds, the materials that life can create. We're now learning how to harness that technology and start to direct it towards human needs.
You say it so matter-of-factly. It's as if it's excuse the pun, a natural thing. For those of us who listen to you and are trying to pay attention and to keep up, give us a sense of the time frame here. Like, I don't know if the discovery of Watson-Crick double helix model, is the right point in time to start. But how fast have we gone from that, which is what I remember, from my school. Tell me in what time frame and how fast we've gotten to where, if I heard you right, not only, can we decipher the code, but we could actually now, start to influence and change and edit the code where we could literally write our own genomes, and that's both exciting and scary, and we'll get into that. But give us a little of the historical perspective, and you've had a front row seat through this whole process, haven't you?
I've been really fortunate that, I got into it at the right time. I missed the early, foundational work with Watson and Crick that happened before I was born. But as we, understanding the structure of DNA gave us insights to how, why it is the molecule of heredity and ultimately the programming language for cells. That was pretty foundational. We started to discover the lexicon, how the genetic code essentially results in the creation of proteins, the building blocks of life, in the late 1960s. And in the early 1970s, we started to get the first manipulation of the code with recombinant DNA technologies, the first generation biotech industry, so to speak, starting with Genentech, and now being utilized by laboratories and companies all over the world. The thing that's really started to shift, though, as biology became more digital, and I kind of placed this on the timeline, the early 1990s, as we started, the Human Genome Project was announced, this global effort to go and read the genomes, not just of people, but of really all organisms. This created a mushrooming amount of data at the code level, genetic code level of more and more creatures. As we've read their genomes and started to map what those genomes actually do in terms of cellular metabolism. And that's an ongoing process. We have not sequenced every organism on the planet, but the pace of sequencing has continued to increase. The analysis of that information is becoming increasingly automatic. There's pipelines now for analyzing the code that is streaming off of sequencers globally, and correlating it to function and dysfunction, things like disease. And then we started to see the rise of a field called synthetic biology, which is a really bad name in some ways because there's nothing really synthetic about it. But now we have the ability to synthesize DNA from scratch, which essentially allows us to write programs that may be to direct the cell to make a particular material or drug, or in some cases, really create the entire organism. Today, we're working with simple organisms, single-celled organisms like bacteria and yeast and viruses. But if we look at the tools that allow us to design and write DNA, they're improving very quickly. And we're already starting to prepare a community for being able to design and build cells and multicellular systems. So essentially doing genome design and construction.
Let's stick with
it's moving fast.
It's moving so fast. My head spins just thinking about it. I want to stick on the reading it first, and then we'll talk about writing it and designing. But just on the reading thing, while all of that was going on, of course, it was enabled, by information technology and tools, and it's really affected the economics, right? So just our ability to read our genomes, right? It used to be this insurmountable, only a special few of us could do it, right? It needed Cray supercomputers, and in parallel is the image I have of what it took, to where the price of this and the technology deployed to do it, where we can all read our genomes. Where are we on that?
Oh, it's been a fascinating trend. So the Human Genome Project was launched in 1990 with the goal of reading the human genome, which is about accurately, it's about 6 billion base pairs of code, and it was one of those moonshot projects that was slated to take 15 years. But the technology for reading genomes advanced very quickly over those 15 years. It was actually completed in 2003, a couple of years ahead of schedule, on budget. That's not because there was great project management. It's just that the underlying technology became so much more powerful and inexpensive over that time period. You have to realize that was using the human genome as kind of the catalyst and focus. But really, the technology is universal for reading DNA. It allowed us to start reading the genome of all organisms. The project was officially closed in 2003, but the technology has continued to advance very quickly and at a pace that is blistering, at times outpacing Moore's law by over 500%. In practical terms, that means just looking at the human genome, it took 13 years to really read the first human genome with a total cost of over $3 billion. Today, reading a human genome complete, not just sampling and reading small parts of the genome, but getting a full genomic picture, it can be as little as $300 and take a day. So the technology has continued to advance. I don't think we've hit the bottom yet in terms of speed or price, but it's really opening this scenario now where we can see a day that, one day all humans will be sequenced, and every organism we share the planet with will be sequenced. And that will probably happen sometime over this century. So
unbelievable.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable. And if I can just add one point,
go ahead.
Economics of this. The economics of this has been remarkable because, again, it was billions of dollars to do the first human genome. Today, it's a few hundred. And so we've seen this economic inflection point where now we can get basically more economic value out of reading a human genome than the cost of acquiring it, which is why I've coined the term economically exothermic. Now it's become a sustainable reaction where now the more people you can sequence, the more value you have in your organization that's doing that work, whether it's an academic group or a company.
Which is when it really starts to get interesting, and we can come back and talk about my favorite topic of business models that evolve and how do we disrupt them. But if we're in this space now where this technology, while it continues to emerge at an incredible pace, just where it is today, opens up the possibility for all of us to have access to our genomes, right, and all kinds of models for how we get at it because the cost has come down. Let's talk about the so what. Okay, we can read the genome and we can go all the way down to reading our own genome. Let's talk about what that means from the perspective of our own health and well-being. I want to start with the healthcare system the way it works today, right? Like, what are the use cases for having this incredible superpower, right? To be able to read genomes, and then we'll layer in the what does it mean to be able to actually write, to edit, to change, to synthesize genomes. But just the existing genomes alone, if it's almost free, for us to have all that data and access it, what does it mean to have it? How well do we understand what it means?
Well, we certainly don't understand the entirety of our genomes, but the original vision for reading the human genome was would become one of the most powerful diagnostic tools for humanity, because now we can actually both collectively and understanding the human genome, but more taking it down to the individual, understanding an individual's genome and how it might be benefiting them in terms of unique capabilities, or understanding their particular diseases because of flaws or corruptions in the code. So this is really powerful. Now we essentially have one of the most powerful diagnostic data sets with our personal genomes coming online. This gives us, and you can get the genome pretty much at conception. My kids are IVF, and they were one was genetically screened before the embryo was implanted. So we had a pretty good heads up on that it was that there were no major gross genetic errors in that embryo. But just getting that information now gives us a heads up on potential diseases in life. The risk factors associated, that we've been making correlations with the genome and various diseases for decades now. That's getting very powerful. It allows us to do very precise diagnostics if there is an undiagnosed disorder. Now we can look in the genome and find essentially what the problems may be in our metabolism based on our genetic code. And then specifically with things like cancer, where there's been corruption of our genome to produce a cancer cell, we can look at the cancer cell and compare it to our normal cells and find the exact mutations that have occurred in our specific cancers, and opening up avenues for very precise treatment, or even the development of personalized drugs that target our specific genetic conditions or failures.
How does it, like all new technologies, we see initially its use in what Clay Christensen would call sustaining use. This is the way we understand, diagnose, and treat disease today. How does this new technology enable us to do that better, smarter, more efficiently, less expensive? So just as you'd expect, the current players in the current healthcare system, starting with research at the macro level all the way down to our care models, it seems to me, are all trying to sort through how do we, the experts and professionals and institutions, leverage this information to help us do a better job of understanding diagnosis and treating disease. And that's starting to play out as the technology makes this let's stop there, talk about the existing healthcare system and how it's using it, and then where I'm going next, where I want to talk about these same technologies in a more disruptive way, should enable us as individuals to have better command and influence over our own health and well-being, and not being dependent as we are today on some professional expert or institution or payor, to decide, how to use this information. Let's start there.
Well, we've just started bringing genomic data into the world of medicine. Really, I've seen a tremendous shift just in the last decade, but we're starting to see, like, for example, when a baby is born, typically a blood sample is taken, a heel prick, and it varies state by state, but a number of metabolic tests are run on that blood sample looking for gross metabolic diseases, so that we can intervene early and in many cases correct them just through things like diet or early treatment. Those screening tests are fairly old school. I looked up where I live in California, and I think they do about 50 tests, and it costs around $250 per baby. Now, for essentially the same price, we can expand our diagnostic capability to look at more than just 50 metabolic diseases. We can essentially get a peek into every metabolic process in that baby. So that's important. I think this is brand new, and it's taken a while for it to kind of start ramping up. But we're seeing genetics be used today in a variety of areas. One, diagnosing new or yet poorly understood diseases, particularly with children that may not, where we can have rare diseases that aren't understood yet. We're certainly seeing it in cancer diagnosis and being able to direct treatment in a more personalized way. That makes sense. We're seeing it in terms of leveraging. There's a field called pharmacogenomics where we can actually determine whether a drug will work on an individual based on their genome, because individuals vary in their metabolism. And now we've correlated a lot of metabolism to the ability for a drug to affect that metabolism. So now with pharmacogenomics, we can actually say, oh, well, you should get a lower dose of this drug because you're a super responder, or don't take this drug because based on your genetic profiling, it's not going to be effective for you. So there's ways to enhance the current medical system by giving better insights into early diagnosis or leveraging the drugs that we have today in better ways. And on the very forefront, using the information from our genome or from the genome of something like a cancer cell to actually create very specific personalized treatments, whether that's a gene therapy or an immunotherapy that specifically targets those cells. And this is just the earliest days. These are the low-hanging fruit that's coming out of the genome. That as we start to get millions and potentially billions of people coming online, and our understanding of the human genome, of human metabolism, of disease just grows exponentially.
So advise me and the group of us that are focused on personalized medicine, different than precision medicine, so not just enabling professionals to be more targeted and specific about diagnosis and even about the treatment that they provide to us, but as an individual, right? When it's my information, right? And
Yes.
One of the things I worry about, and I know a lot of people worry about, is, it's one thing to worry about social media information and how institutions are using it, right? But when you start talking about our personal genomes and where that information is, and how do I control that information and who has access to it and how it's used, but how do I use that information to inform choices and to put pressure on the institutional healthcare system, to align better with my health and wellness goals and what I'm trying to do? How do I take more control? How would you advise us? How big a role does genomics play as we start thinking about personalized models and unleashing agency for individuals and families to have more influence and control over their own health and well-being?
Oh, this is, you kind of hit the nail on the head. This is, we're in a transition now. The first, originally, the only people that really had access to your genome and the interpretation were professionals, physicians and researchers. So it wasn't really providing a lot of benefit for the average person. Then we started to see the rise of consumer genomics, spearheaded by 23andMe. Which opened the idea of, oh wow, you've got a genome, and we can start to, with something as simple as a spit test, we can start to evaluate certain health risks or lineage. It turns out that ancestry was kind of the really popular. People wanted to know where they were from and who they were related to, and that could be elucidated from the early genomic tests. It's becoming more comprehensive today because now we can essentially offer a full genome analysis at low price points, essentially consumer price points. So this is now people are starting to realize, oh, well, this is my information. I should get some benefit from it if my information is used to lower the cost of health insurance. If it's going to advance research in academia, if it's going to help a drug company make a new drug. So we're seeing a business model shift away from companies kind of aggregating this genomic information, and then on the back end creating deals with pharma or researchers, to now putting the individual front and center, saying this is your information. Let's have some sort of a lease agreement to that information that will benefit, say, researchers or drug developers, and let's figure out the right profit sharing, essentially, or information sharing, so that the individual can benefit from that information directly. So those business models are still emerging. There's only a handful of companies that have have been born into that space or are making that transition. But I think today, mapped onto what we've seen with social networking, there will be a small handful of groups that just find the right dynamics to grow their community faster and faster. So I wrote an essay on this, like who will be the Google or Facebook of genomics moving forward. It'll be the one that just you trust them with your data. They're giving you the right benefits in return for sharing that information. They're helping you secure that information. They're helping you get you the maximum informational benefits. Because I want to be clear, you're not going to be able to analyze your genome effectively as an individual. It really takes some of the most powerful computing systems and algorithms that we've ever developed to stay on top of the R&D and maximize the benefits. So I almost look at it as an wealth management or even an agency model where, if you have a particularly unique genome, just like if you're a particularly unique individual in the sports or entertainment world, you have an agent. I look at the next business models really putting you front and center, understanding you, and again managing your genomic wealth and personal existence maximally.
I love that. Of course, that validates a lot of the conversations you and I have had and some of the thinking that it's really worth thinking about these models with individuals at the core as opposed to the afterthought of what happens with the information. In this case, there's a lot at stake for us to do that, but still early days. And I take your point about it's going to take access to expertise and platforms and tools, but they're going to be configured in a different way, and we're going to access them in a different way when they have our interest and our lens at the front end of it. So exciting and so much for us to do. Can we kind of last question area here? This is always the part where I think you scare us, because I ask you, to help me understand where this is going. So it gets more to the writing new genomes, the ability to edit and influence this, which starts to bring in all of the ethical concerns and some of the things we read about in the news. I think it's important that we understand where the technology is going, and then of course we as humans, need to be paying attention because we get to shape how these things move in society, and we better not be passive in that. So scare us a little bit about the future and the potential about where this goes.
Well, let's just keep it at the level of cells for the moment. Our ability to design metabolism is growing very quickly, and so we've got a number of companies now that are focusing on designing new drugs from scratch, reprogramming cells to make materials that are structurally important, for building the world around us. An example there's a wonderful company called Bolt Threads, which has taken genes from the spider producing spider silk and put them in yeast. So now we can generate spider silk at industrial scale. That moves into the textile world. We're seeing cellular agriculture, being able to grow cells in culture to address things like foodstuffs. My favorite example here is a company called Perfect Day that makes milk, brewing milk like we brew beer. And so if you need milk, you don't need a whole cow. You just need the right proteins being put into water. But the ability to design and build metabolism is growing very quickly because we've got the landscape of most metabolism, and the tools for writing genetic code are sufficient now to be able to rewrite metabolism of a cell fairly easily. Where it starts to get controversial is when we start using some of these genome editing tools like CRISPR, which is a tool that essentially allows us to make precise changes in a genome, not write the whole genome, but just make edits in the genome. When we start using the CRISPR technologies and gene editing technologies to modify the human genome, then you start running into some really interesting ethical issues. And if we've seen that most recently with the work that came out of China and gene edited babies. This was a first instance, so it created a lot of this. It's provoking a lot of discussion in the community. How do we move forward when we can start gene editing ourselves? This is ongoing. And then looking a little forward, you mentioned that I'm a co-founder of the Genome Project, right? This is kind of the other side of the coin with the Human Genome Project. This is, we see a day now where the ability to write genetic code is increasing exponentially, and within a relatively short time frame, still over, between a decade and 2 decades, we should have the technological capability to write large genomes like animal genomes and plant genomes and certainly the human genome. So what does that mean when, again, in the future, not here, but we can sit down and start to really on a global scale say, well, what do I want my baby's genome to look like? These are, this isn't just, my baby potentially has, some, I want to make some changes to eliminate these, potential markers that indicate they could have cancer. Let's get rid of those and try and make them cancer-free, or correct a major metabolic error that might produce a disease or deficiency. Like this is like, basically using a CAD tool, essentially, like we would design a building. How do we design a baby? These are things we have to start thinking about, because the underlying technology that allows those types of choices to be made are coming on fast.
Well, Andrew, I so appreciate, my head always spins after a conversation with you. My conclusion is, I'm generally, like I know you are, an optimist, but we got to pay attention, right? These technologies are moving very quickly, and they have real impact on society. And so we have a real role to play here. And this one, more than almost any other emerging technology, is both exciting and scary at the same time, and we just can't sit back and be passive about it. On a practical basis, I think that you validate that there are lots of exciting new business models, and ways to design from the individual out, as opposed to individuals having to deal with a complicated, kludgy healthcare system that isn't really designed for our experience and isn't really capitalizing on the personalization necessary, that genomics just puts on steroids. So you've given us a lot to think about. It won't be your last visit to the Business Model Sandbox. I'm so glad we're connected. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today, Andrew. It's always great to connect with you.
Oh, you're welcome, Saul. This is definitely going to affect the U.S. healthcare system in particular, because we're still trying to. The U.S. healthcare system is really unique in the world, and in that it is economically very important. It's a leader in many different areas, but it's also very fragmented. In some of my discussions with healthcare providers today, it's like, okay, if you can sit down with a blank sheet of paper and all of these powerful new diagnostic and treatment modalities that are being empowered by digital biology, what does that look like? And if you just started from scratch and didn't have to worry about bringing along a legacy system, how does that look? And I think it's going to be transformative to what we think of in terms of personal health moving forward.
I totally agree. Thanks, Andrew.